Gary, let's talk about Jesus actually did die on the cross. All the evidence is there. You even have non-Christian sources, which you wrote a book, The Historical Jesus. You got all the non-Christian sources in here. All of them say Jesus died. And Tabor in the Jesus dynasty, he says, you know, it's almost incredible that anybody would say that he didn't die. I mean, that's a sure fact. But let's get Jesus dead here. How do we know for sure Jesus died? And then what about these resurrection appearances? And did Paul just have a vision?
Well, that's a tall order. Some of the relevant facts here are medical. And unfortunately, we know crucifixion from more than the first century. Reported crucifixions during the Nazi persecution of Jews. There are several medical doctors who've asked for male volunteers to be crucified, and they've observed what's happened. One with a radiologist who watched what happened during the chest. There are different views on exactly what happens, but the predominant view is still, and Michael Bagent reports this, interestingly enough, that the predominant view is that death by crucifixion is essentially death by asphyxiation. If you hang with your arms out, the weight of your body pulling down, the closer your arms are to your head, the faster it's over. In one experiment in Germany a number of years ago, the men passed out at a maximum of 11 minutes. Now that's too soon for historic crucifixion, but that's because the men were hanging from 2x4s and their feet were not attached to anything. What attaching feet does is actually prolong it, because as long as you can push up and you can free your lungs, the predominant view again, you can breathe. But gravity, pain, because you're pushing up on the nails in the case of many of these. By the way, almost every ancient reference to crucifixion mentions nails, not ropes. That doesn't mean people couldn't have been tied, but almost everyone mentioned nails. So you're going to push up on nails. I think it's kind of built in here. Very painful, anti-gravity. You can't stay up there very long. You slump back down, you begin asphyxiating. You don't have to have a medical degree if you're standing there to make sure the person's dead. All you have to do is, how long has he been in the low position of the cross? Because the low position of the cross is designed to ensure death. Then you have this detail in the Gospel of John that they stabbed Jesus in the side and blood and water came out. The leading medical view is that the spear went through the heart, as indicated by the fact that the water comes from the pericardium, a thin sac that surrounds the heart that holds a watery fluid, and the blood from where it's held in the heart. It's not true, by the way, that dead men do not bleed. Now, some New Testament critics have said, that's a spiritual mention here by John. We don't find anywhere else. I'll just mention there are two references outside the New Testament to people having their chest pierced. Martin Hingel's little book on crucifixion mentions several sorts of coup de grace, a crushed skull, a bow and arrow to finish a guy off. Broken ankles are for that reason, so the person can't push back up. Recently, James D.G. Dunn, in his book Remembering Jesus, said that he takes very seriously the references outside the Gospels to the piercing, just to make sure the job's done. Makes sense. So you've got the asphyxiation, you've got the chest wound. We already mentioned the Strauss critique. This isn't the kind of person, the person who comes out of this is a person who's alive, but that kind of person is not raised from the dead. So these are just a few of the reasons, but today it is virtually unanimous among scholars. And besides, if he didn't die on the cross, you got to get James on board. How does Paul come on board later from a raised Jesus who's walking around?
Because all through the
healed.
New Testament Gospels, you have the family of Jesus didn't believe in him. I mean, the brothers, James and Jude.
Mark 3, John 7.
They didn't believe in him. And the only thing that seemed to have turned them around is what 1 Corinthians 15 says is he appeared to James. Well,
James.
that would do it, wouldn't it?
It would. It would. And yet you have Tabor saying that tradition, that vision tradition, doesn't go through Jesus' family, if I understand him correctly. So, yeah, a lot of claims contrary to it. And I keep saying over and over again what the majority of scholars grants today. Almost nobody takes apparent death. But I should say, this isn't established because almost everybody concedes it. It's the other way around. Almost everybody concedes it because we have multiply attested facts that come in from different angles. You only concede, I mean, a good scholar concedes what the data says. So the fact that the data says it is far more important than scholars concede it. But when you get both, I think we're onto something pretty heavy historical fact.
All right, talk about the empty tomb, because Tabor says there were two graves, and everybody's got a version on this. Of course, Bagent says he didn't die at all, so he escaped and went down to Egypt and then over to France. And I'm just saying, talk about the actual data in the New Testament that shows he was buried.
Yeah, and Craig's done a lot of things on this too, on the burial, but I recently counted virtually everything in print on the resurrection, French, German, English. And what came out of this is 23 different arguments for the empty tomb cited by recent New Testament scholarship. This is an amazing number of arguments. By far, the most common one is that women report this. And the idea is, if you're going to make up a story in the first century, and by the way, it's not true, what you often hear, women could not testify. They could testify, but oftentimes there's an inverse relationship between how important the data are and whether you use women. The more important it is, you don't use women. Now, if you're making up a story, you don't use witnesses on this important fact where the audience is going to say, used women. Why does each of the Gospels cite women? Because women were the ones that went to the tomb. Now, that has impressed a generation of scholars. But you also have what I call Jerusalem factor. If you're going to make Jesus raised from the dead, put the tomb in Turkey. Put it somewhere else. Not in the city where the church is born, where a Sunday stroll could determine whether the grave is open or closed. You also have enemy attestation. You also have multiple attestation on the empty tomb. They do, contrary to a few New Testament scholars, the New Testament empty tomb texts are not dependent on Mark. We have 3 or 4 independent attestations here to the empty tomb. This is heavy stuff. And you know, one of the favorite comebacks of the critics, some of the more further left critics, I'll say, well, hey, your own source tells you that they didn't preach the gospel for 50 days. Come on. After 50 days, you would not recognize the body. I say, wait a minute. Whoa, 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 whoa. This is a moot point. The Gospels did not proclaim, we have a tomb with an unidentifiable body. And since it's unidentifiable, it's not Jesus. No, their claim only works if there's no body in the tomb. And anybody could, confirm that with a Sunday afternoon stroll in Jerusalem. So don't put it in Jerusalem, and don't use women. The exact 2 rules they disagree with, plus multiple attestation, plus enemy. We're on the road to a good factor. And by the way, the vast majority of New Testament scholars, about 75%, if you count them, about 75% concede the empty tomb.
All right, we got to hold up there. We got 1 minute left. Craig, what hits you with what Gary was saying here? Summarize what we've talked about today.
The Jewish people took burial very seriously. So any idea that a person still alive put in a tomb, or a person not buried at all, or the idea that somebody lost track of Jesus's body or it went missing, all of that is condescension, and frankly, it is insulting to the Jewish people. They took burial traditions very seriously. The Gospels rightly note, the women noted where Jesus was buried. Why? Because eventually his body would be moved to a family tomb when the law allowed it. Remember, Jesus died the death of a criminal, and so his burial was not in the hands of his family, but his family could keep track of his body, at the very least, a year later, gather his bones, place them in an ossuary, and put the ossuary in the family tomb. We have to keep the facts in mind when we interpret the Gospels.
All right. In our next program, I want to talk about some of the hype and the buzz that surrounds these books. But I also want to talk about one thing that they're all sure about, and that is Jesus never claimed that he was God. All right? And we want to talk about where he did claim that. Also, that Son of Man statement that keeps coming up and came up at his trial. We want to talk about Pilate. And was he in cahoots with Jesus? Or everybody seems to disagree with the New Testament view of how Pilate is presented. We think that it's right on target, and we got a lot of evidence to support that. So all that we're going to talk about in our next program.